Do a review in Likkutei Sichos in Chelek Yutes, volume 19, the fourth Sicha for the Parshas Re'eh. In this week's Parsha, it talks about that when the slave goes free by Yovel, then you must load him up, Hanik Tanik, the mitzvah of Hanukkah. The Rebbe in the Sicha is coming to make clear that while it may seem, according to the Minchas Chinuch's understanding of the Rambam, that according to the Rambam, it would not apply today to a worker, the laws of Hanukkah, but the Rebbe says not so. The Rebbe answers the question of the Minchas Chinuch and explains that the Rambam's view, notwithstanding that he says that the only Eved slave that you have to give Hanukkah from the Torah is if he was sold by Beis Din. But if a slave sells himself, the Rambam rules that there is no Hanukkah there. And yet the Rebbe says, the Rebbe concludes that when a person hires himself nowadays, because of the moral obligation that the Chinuch talks about, today there is that obligation. The Rebbe also takes this to the spiritual level, that when you are helping and giving someone, you become his master, and he his employer. That's a student to the Rav. You also must not just give him the regular teaching, but you have to be Hanukkah to give him the extra, as the Rebbe will explain in the Sikha. But let's go step by step. Re'ei Daled Ois Aleph. Wegen der Mitzvah von Hanukkah, with regards to the mitzvah of loading, of gifting to the slave, was der Odin darf geben dem Eved, which the master is required to give to the slave, was geht daraus frei von ihm, that goes out free of him. The Chinuch steht in Sefer HaChinuch, the Sefer HaChinuch writes that while this mitzvah literally from the Torah does not apply today, but the moral of the mitzvah does apply today as well. As choch mi is mechuyev in their mitzvah, although we are obligated in this mitzvah, nor bizman shahayovel noyeg, only during the time in which the yovel, the 50th year, is applicable. We celebrate and we have the 50th year. That is when the slaves go out free. That is when we have the mitzvah of Hanukkah. Because of the time of when the Yovel is not noyeg. We're talking about here an Eved Ivri who goes out either by the 7th year, and then if his ear is drilled, then he goes out at the 50th year, or the 50th year comes in between. But whatever the case is, whenever this Jewish slave goes out free, is nitod der din von Eved Ivri. We don't have the law of Eved Ivri, so we don't have b'chlal a Jewish slave, so there is no Hanukkah, so there is no din that would apply. However, says the Chinuch, from the law, the way it is, bisman shehayovel noiheg, we can learn morally, kemen aber der fun uplearn. We can, however, learn from this. As oich bisman has also now the yishma chochem ve'yosef lekach. A person should listen, a wise listens, and he adds a lesson for themselves. If you hire a Jewish person, the of the zman meruba, he works for you for a long time, or or even a little time, he works for you. That you have to load him up when he leaves you. From that which the blessed Hashem has blessed you, you must share it with this worker, with the worker that is leaving you. And as we'll see later on in the Sikha, whether he's leaving you because you have no longer need for his services, because you got other workers doing the work, or you're not happy even with his services. In either case, you need to give him Hanukkah, as well as the Rebbe will articulate this later on. However, on the face of it, the Minchas Chinuch says that this lesson and moral obligation that is in a person, is on the employer, does not apply to all opinions, because some opinions hold that only if Beis Din sold the slave is he entitled to Hanukkah, but a slave that sells himself isn't entitled to Hanukkah. So the Minchas Chinuch says that what the Chinuch said, that we have morally an obligation, but you see clearly the Torah did not obligate every slave, only if sold by Beis Din. Matter of fact, that's the opinion of the Rambam, as the Rebbe will bring down, who also says only if the Beis Din sells you get Hanukkah. So it turns out that according to that opinion, there is no lesson to learn from the fact that the Torah gives Hanukkah. That's in the unique case in which he was sold by the Beis Din. Sometimes when a person steals money, he doesn't have money to pay, Beis Din will sell him. Then there is Hanukkah. But in a case where a person is poor and he needs to pay bills and he sells himself for a slave, an Eved Ivri, there is no din of Hanukkah. So why would there be a din? The Chinuch says there is no din of Hanukkah by a person who would hire himself out as a worker. And nowadays, when there is no slaves, it wouldn't be Hanukkah, because the Torah didn't grant Hanukkah for a ordinary slave, only by one who was sold by Beis Din. So it comes out, according to the Rambam, there would not be Hanukkah for a worker today. But the Minchas Chinuch says that it turns out that the Chinuch says that you do have to give Hanukkah today. We learn it from that halacha. But according to the Rambam, who says that Hanukkah does not apply to a regular slave, a person would not get Hanukkah. So it seems that the Chinuch deviates from the opinion of Rambam. Let's look inside. Zog the Minchas Chinuch. So the Minchas Chinuch says about this. Ados was miken oplan for mitzvahs Hanukkah b'negeya to asochim b'zman hazeh. This that we can learn from the mitzvah of Hanukkah as it relates to a hired person, an employee in nowadays, as mitzad musorei hatoy, because of his good morals, from the maskir, from the hirer, from the employer. Darfer im meinig sein b'tzeitzim im, he has to load him, he has to grant him, compensate him when he leaves him, is not a loit der deya. That's only according to the view as der chiyuv fun Hanukkah. The obligation of giving in compensation is dosai by an eved was Beis Din not im verkauft, whether it's a slave that was been sold by Beis Din, usai by an eved was verkauft sich allein, and also by a slave who sells himself. According to that opinion, the Minchas Chinuch explained, that is according to whom the Chinuch is talking about when he said that we need to morally today also compensate and give Hanukkah for a worker that has worked for us. Over the Minchas Chinuch concludes that as mitzvahs Hanukkah is gizogevar, according to the opinion that the mitzvah of gifting, loading him, giving him, compensating and giving him is gizogevar nor by an evet shemachru Beis Din, that it's only said by a slave that was sold by Beis Din, and we learn it from a pasuk. According to that opinion, the Gemara learned this from pasuk. The Gemara derives this, learns it out of the verse. It says, Hanik Tanik Loi. This is talking about the pasuk by a Meicher Machru Beis Din sold him, and there the Torah says the word Loi. You have to grant him, gift him, Tanik loy veloy lemoicher atzmai. So we learn from this just to him, but not the one who sells themselves. According to that, says the Minchas Chinuch, is doch der tam for mitzvahs hanoka. So what's the reason? Why is there a mitzvah to give hanik tanik? What is the mitzvah hanoka? Nit mitzada musar. Then it's not because of morally that you should give your worker from your blessings to share with him when he leaves you. It's not because of that. And he says, is that we don't really know the reason. And he says, if the reason why we have to give the Hanukkah is based on moral, mitzad musar, is doch nitokin tam zu mechalik sein. There is no reason to distinguish between the two categories of slaves, whether you were sold by Beis Din or sold by yourself. It's a moral obligation. Why should you morally, if it's a moral obligation? So apparently it's not a moral obligation. And since it's not a moral obligation, the Torah made a unique requirement by one who was sold by Beis Din that he would get the Hanukkah. Therefore, we cannot learn from this as it relates to a hired worker, to an employee during nowadays, because according to the other opinion, this is not a moral, and therefore we don't have any reason to learn from Hanukkah because that's unique. However, the Rambam, the Minchas Chinuch, remains with a problem over here. Because if this is true, what he concludes, that it makes a difference between these two opinions, we have a problem with the Rambam. It seems like the Rambam does not follow the ruling of the Minchas Chinuch that nowadays we do have a moral obligation to give a worker Hanukkah by a worker. And therefore, the Minchas Chinuch asks, the Minchas Chinuch bleibt aber bei Akashi, remains with a question. The Rambam Paskendov, the Rambam rules, though, as Hanukkah is neheges nor by Machru Bezdin, that this mitzvah of Hanukkah is only conducted if you were sold by the court, by Machru Bezdin. Bezdin sells it. Unleuten Chinuch kommt ois, but according to the Chinuch, who says that we also have Bisman Hazeh, an obligation to Hanukkah, kommt ois as der Chiyuv von Hanukkah is oich by Meicher Atzme, is also yourself. That's the only way we can have a moral obligation. So what's the Minchas Chinuch's problem? Is nitshkiach. It's not commonplace. Rabbi Mechaber, the author, which is the Chinuch, he should tilt away from the view of the Rambam, unless the Chinuch would specifically say, I'm ruling against the Rambam. Here he doesn't. So the Minchas Chinuch remains with a question on his distinction that only according to the Chinuch's ruling that you have to give Hanukkah Bisman Hazeh, an employee deserves Hanukkah, that only goes if we hold that the mitzvah's Hanukkah applies also to a person who sells himself, but the Rambam runs no, and therefore there is no, seems the Rambam there would be no Hanukkah, and the Minchas Chinuch says there is Hanukkah. It means that he disagrees with the Rambam, that he rules that it applies both by Meicher Atzmei and Machru Bezdin. That's why there is a moral obligation of Hanukkah. The Rebbe in Ois Beis and in the Sicha, the Rebbe answers differently, that it's not necessarily the way the Minchas Chinuch understood it. The Rebbe explains that even if we say that the mitzvahs of the Hanukkah only is if you sold by Beis Din, still we learn the moral obligation today for paying Hanukkah to the worker that we hire, which means that we do not have to say, or we don't say, in order not to have a problem with the Rambam, we don't have to say that the only way to learn today's moral obligation of paying this Hanukkah, this compensation to a worker, is only if the laws of Hanukkah apply to also a Moicher Atzme selling himself. But no, even if we rule like the Rambam, like the opinion that only Machruhu Bezdin gets Hanukkah, and still there's a moral obligation, the Chinuch still applies according to that opinion, that we would still need to do Hanukkah. Yes, Shloimar Beis, yes, Shloimar Letaretz Ulevayin. So we can say, in order to answer and to explain, that limud as Hanukkah is noiheges nor by Machruhu Beis Din. This that we learn that Hanukkah only applies if sold by Beis Din, unit by Moicher Atzmei, not if you sell yourself. We can learn it in two ways. The Rebbe is going to explain. One way is to learn that this is something which is a novelty that you have to pay extra, more than you hired, more than you paid for the Eved. Go pay him more money now. And therefore, we can only learn it wherever the Torah was mechadish, wherever the Torah told us. And therefore, only Machruhu Beis Din gets Hanukkah. And we can't learn a moral obligation to this because really you get zero, because we don't know. The Torah is mechadish that you get when the Machruhu Beis Din. And therefore, we cannot learn out a hired worker nowadays. But there's another way of saying it. The saying it is that the Eved deserves, all Evedim deserve. For some reason, a Gezeres HaKosuf, that if you sell yourself, over there the Torah excluded you and did not give you the Hanukkah. But the moral obligation would apply in nowadays as well. Even though that a Moicher Atzmai, selling yourself, would not get Hanukkah, that would be because the Torah made that unique exception to the rule. Let's look inside. Number one, Aleph, the Chidush for Hanukkah is, the novelty of Hanukkah is, as medarf meinig sein dem Evet vos machruhu Beis Din. The Chidush is that you need to give, you have to give Hanukkah to the slave that has been sold by Beis Din. Hanik tanik loy. Give it to him. Load him up. We know the Torah is mechadish. We only can learn to the extent the Torah is novelty. The Torah says, give a slave who's been sold by Beis Din, which doesn't deserve anything more, just give him. So we can only know it in that case. Then automatically, one who sells himself, he's not in this chiddush, he doesn't get Hanukkah. And if this is the way to learn it, we cannot learn from sale of Beis Din that he gets Hanukkah for a hired work that we should give him also Hanukkah. But the other way to learn it, Beis, the Chidush is Nid was annimkar durch Bezdin bakumt Hanoke. The novelty is not that one who was sold by Bezdin receives the extra Hanoka. But the Chiddush over here is nor loy v'loy lemecharatzmei. The Chiddush is that the one who sold himself does not get. That's a novelty. Those was hameicharatzmei bakumt nit kein Hanoka. The fact that a person who sells himself does not get that Hanoka, that's the novelty. Und by them, oifen kommt ois. So if this is the way to learn it, that the Torah was mechadish specifically that one who sells himself does not get Hanoka, as afilu loit, so it comes out afilu loit derteya. As by Meicher Atzmei, they talk in Hanoka, even according to the view that if you sell yourself, there is no Hanoka. Kenman aber fundin Hanoka by Machru Bezdin. We still, from the halacha, that you're supposed to give Hanoka when Bezdin sells you, that there is Hanoka upland of andere Fall. We can learn in other cases, because that's not the Chiddush that you get the Hanoka, as long as you're not excluded that you sold yourself. So you can learn in other cases, as Oich Bazei, so Zaina Gewisse Chiv Hanoka, by them too, there shall be a certain obligation, a moral obligation, some of obligation. As long as they're didn't sell themselves, was befedish nesmayit from Hanoka, which is specifically been excluded from Hanoka. And therefore, according to the second idea, since the chinuch over here is discussing Nit wegen einem, was hat sich verkauft als Eved. We're not talking about an employee who hired himself out to his employer, to a worker. So we're talking not about somebody who's sold himself to a slave. That's not, when the chinuch says you have to give a Hanoka, we're not talking about selling yourself for a slave. Moicher atzmei, which would be the category, selling yourself, which the Torah excludes from Hanoka. Today you can't sell yourself. There's no Evet today. There's no Yovel. Nor we're talking about a hired worker. One who hired himself out as a worker. So we could still learn from Machru Bezdin the moral obligation as mitzad hamusar, from the moral obligations, Zolmanim Gevin Hanoka, he should get the Hanoka when he leaves, when the worker leaves to him. And the fact that a Moicher Atzmi does not get, that's the exception. Now, so the Chinuch is independent of having, we don't have to say that the Chinuch holds that the din of Hanoka is by both, even by Meicher Atzmei. No, the Chinuch can hold that the din Hanoka is only by Machruhu Bezdin, and still, Bizman Hazeh, since a poyel, a worker, Bizman Hazeh nowadays wants to, when he leaves the boss, then he has to do the Hanoka because he's not been excluded, because he's not a Meicher Atzmei. And now the question is, what is the Rambam's view? And the Rebbe wants to prove now that the Rambam's view is actually that even if you are, the Rambam rules that only Machruhu Bezdin, but the Rebbe wants to prove that the Rambam's goes with the logic that the Chiddush is not Machru Bezdin that he gets Hanoka, but the Chiddush is that Meicher Atzmei does not get Hanoka, and therefore he'll work together with work fine with the Chinuch. Because first the Rebbe wants to say, so Taka, what's the idea? The Rebbe explains the Hasbara. Why do we say one way or the other way? We just said there's a possibility of saying both ways. And the Rebbe wants to explain that the idea is, what is Hanoke? Is Hanoke, what is this Hanoke payment? What is this? Is it sort of in addition to the pay that you made up? Then that seems to be a big chiddush. Why would I have to pay more than what we agreed upon? So there, if that's the source, then it seems more logical that only where the Torah says you do it, because in all other places, there's no need, no reason to pay the worker more money than you had agreed upon. The other idea that Hanoke is not an additional payment for the work. Hanoke is sort of a charitable, an extra charitable, that meaning as a recognition, appreciation for the work you did, giving you a bonus, an extra bonus. It's not looked at as pay, it's extra bonus. If it is an extra bonus, so then it's just the other way. Then everybody should deserve the extra bonus. And if the Torah excludes the Moichad Atzmai, but everybody else should get the bonus because that's a charity. And the Rebbe will prove that the Rambam, because he places the laws of Hanukkah together after the laws of charity, that the Rambam learns that it's charity, and therefore even anyone has to be able to get the Hanukkah, even though the Torah exempted specifically the Moichad Atzmai, that for some reason that he does not get. Let's look inside Gimel. We can say as the Tzvei Efanim in Limud Anal. These two ways how we can learn whether the Chiddush is that the Meicheru Bezdin gets it, or the Chiddush is that Meicher Atzmei doesn't get it. So these two ways of learning is Anatolu the Tzvei Efane Hasbara, and the two explanations that we can give, Osmeken Zogen, the meaning for Hanukkah, that we can give about the idea of Hanukkah. Aleph. Number one is Ageder for Schar Pula. It is in the definition. It's a pay for the work, for the acts, that what he's done. This is mashma from Gemara. That's as it appears in the Gemara. Sochir korye rachamona. The Torah referred to this Eved as a hired person. Mas sochir puulose liyershav. Just like a hired person, the work that he gets money, and the inheritors will get it eventually. Av hai puulose liyershav. Also, this Eved needs to get something so that he can give to his children, he can give to his inheritors. So that's why you give him the Hanukkah. In that case, that the work, that we call it a work, and the work requires giving him extra, according to this way, it is logical. As the Chidush V'Gzeiris HaKosov is that what is the novelty? What did the verse decree? Is those was der Evet Shemachru based in Bakum Tanoch, that Hanoch, that this slave that has been sold by Best, that he should get Hanoch. That seems to be, if the payment Hanoch is sort of a extra payment, then it seems like the Chiddush is that we give a slave that was sold by Best Hanoch. While der Manik sein beteure Scharpula, because to give him as a payment for his work, in addition to what you already payment, this is in addition to that you already paid, or you're paying the entire pay for the entire work, you already paid that. And to give addition is a chiddush, that's a novelty. That would be a novelty, and we would not apply it anywhere else. But based on another idea, what is Hanukkah? What is the definition of Hanukkah? Says I gather from tzedakah. That's a gather. It's not paid for the work, but it's an addition like charity. Was der Odin gibt als Anerkennung von der Arbeit von Eved. The master gives it in recognition and appreciation for the work of this slave. And according to this approach, is Seichel Mechayev, logic dictates. At der Chidush v'Gzeres HaKosov, that what is the novelty, what is the decree of the verse, is dos vos amoicher atzmei bakum nit kein Hanukkah, is the fact that selling yourself, you don't get the Hanukkah. That's a Chiddush. Why not? Val dos vos by machru bezdin dav zayin Hanukkah, because why do we give when bezdin sold you get Hanukkah? Logical is Amilsa B'Taimek and out. The reasoning you have to show appreciation. Why shouldn't you have to show appreciation when a person sold himself? And the answer is that it's a Gzeres HaKosov. So now let's see what the Rambam's view is. This is the Shita from the Rambam. What is the view in them in this? Kemenes HaRuislan and their phone. So we can derive it, we can learn this out from the fact was in Sefer HaMitzvahs, in the book of Mitzvahs, tell the Rambam the mitzvah from Hanukkah. The Rambam places the mitzvah of this Hanukkah, nitzavish in the mitzvahs from Eved V'Amu. Doesn't put it about the mitzvahs where a male servant and a female slave, where the laws about them discussed, nor gleich, nor their mitzvah from tzedakah. He places it immediately after the mitzvah of charity. That's where he places the mitzvah of Hanukkah. From them, Somchala, the fact that the Rambam brings it close to the mitzvah, to mitzvah tzedakah, to mitzvah tzedakah, is mashmer appears as Levidas Rambam. And according to Rambam's view, is Hanukkah in Geder from tzedakah. Hanukkah is in the same status, the same definitions as tzedakah. So, therefore, if the Rambam holds that is tzedakah, so the Rambam will also agree to the chinuch that only in a case where the Torah excluded it specifically, which is by moichar atzmai, everywhere else, when we hire a worker today, we need to give him tzedakah. Is noita muzman nitzogim, so therefore we don't have to say, as the Mincha concluded, as the chinuch is noita midas Rambam, that the chinuch is tilting away from the Rambam's view, which means that the chinuch holds that you have to give Hanukkah to both moichar atzmai, moichar bechru bezdin. The Rambam only holds machru bezdin, so that I have to say. Afilu l'shitas harambam as the Torah is memat moichar atzmai for Hanukkah, even according to the Rambam shita, that the Torah excludes somebody who sells himself does get Hanukkah. Can man upland for machru bezdin? We still can learn from the fact that bezdin sells him as mitzad musar, that when it comes because of morals or tzedakah or charity, so man bizman hazeh geb Hanukkah b'tzeisem imay. Also, a hired person nowadays to give him Hanukkah when he leaves him. So basically, the bottom line is that the chinuch can hold exactly like the Rambam, that you only give Hanukkah to machru bezdin, but the reason for Hanukkah is because of charity, as it seems from the Rambam. And once the reason because of charity, we can learn that you should always do that charity. Why does the Torah say a moichar atzmai doesn't get it? And therefore the Rebbe says, the Rebbe is trying to publicize here the halacha that if you have a worker, you must give him Hanukkah. Bibal dalet. Bibal as the Eiro anal fun chinuch. Since the lesson and the message, the instruction of the chinuch can oiskum loit alashitas, can fit according to all views. Oich loit divos halten, also according to those that are of the view As by Moicher Atzma is nitoken hanoka, that when you sell yourself, there's no hanoka. Still, we can learn the moral obligation to worker today that you got to give him hanoka. Is gedai zu ma'oder sein. So it's fitting to encourage umefarsim sein and to publicize it. As mezol mesim lives on to their oder to pay attention to the ruling of the chinuch because it goes according to all opinions. When einer denkt dat zweiten zu arbeiten für ihn, when one hires another to work for him, und es endigt sich die Zeit von seiner Arbeit, and the time of the work has finished. Malachas kama v'kama, and how much more so? Sometimes the time finished it. That was the finished the job. But even for sure, the Rebbe says, wenn man schickt ihm weg von der Arbeit, when you send them away from the work, eider es endigt sich der Zeit, before the time is up, and you send them away. And the Rebbe articulates this. If the job has not been completed, he leaves on his own before the time. Is netod mitzvah von hanoka? Then there is no mitzvah to give to him the hanoka if he leaves on his own. The din by an eved, as the law by an eved, as a bereach v'yoytze begeroin kesef, that either if he runs away or somebody who leaves because he takes the money, pays up for the time that he still owes by giving the money, is manikim ein manikim lo. You don't give hanoka. So if you leave before the time, you don't get on your own. You don't get hanoka. Ober the maskir shiktim avek. But if the employer sends him away, now it doesn't matter why he sends him away. Tzidr far was itz hoter genug poilim on him, whether he has now sufficient workers without him, or that that is nit zufrieden for sein Arbeit. Even if he's not happy with his work, darf him get hanoka, must give him hanoka, must give him. V'bald hanoka dem geder von tzedakah. And since we're giving it as charity, is verstandig, it's understood that you must give him more than what you're required by the law, by the pay. As men kenit yoytze sein mit geben mazach, was mi savim them. You cannot fulfill this obligation of hanoka to give him an item which you're anyways obligated. Der schar was im kommt for sein Arbeit, the pay that he deserves for his work is doch poshut as man darf him abzahlen b'milui. That's obvious that he needs to get paid fully. Afile de hoisofis, even the additions was der balabayis hat from frier abgeret. The addition that the owner, the hirer, had already made up to begin with, to give him the arbiter, to give the worker the arbiter, gehen euch nicht rein in hanoka. They are not included in hanoka. That's not, those additions are not the idea of charity, not the extras. You're not giving extras. And there's also no difference. How long he worked for him. As the language, the chinuch we quoted earlier, whether he worked a little or a lot of time, or even he worked for a short time. And it also doesn't make a difference, as we said before. Said he's for them given zufrieden, whether he was happy with him. Whether the house was blessed because of him. In other words, he feels that he did the job well. Even if it wasn't blessed to him. You have to give hanoka, and the way the payment works, based on the time that he worked. There is a formula for each year to give a month pay or something, but there is a formula based on the time that he worked. How much more so? In a fall when his Baruch Habayis V'Glola, if it was a case, the house was blessed because of him, meaning that his work benched you, blessed you. Was dan is doch der din, then the halacha is that lifi habrocha tedloi, give him according to the blessing, more than the minimal obligation. You have to add to the Hanoke from that which the blessed Hashem blessed you. Now, this is the physical, the literal halacha that Rebbe wants to publicize. And it's self-understood, a lot of issues came to the Rebbe over the years in which people lost their jobs, whether they were educators, whether they were working. And the Rebbe wants people to publicize for the employers to know, the administration to know what their obligation, and it doesn't make a difference if they're happy with the work or sending him away because they're not happy. It does not affect the mitzvah of tzedakah of Hanukkah regardless. Hey, the Rebbe wants to transfer this over also to the spiritual level of Hanukkah in teaching, in which you become sort of the higher of the person who you are teaching is your worker, is your worker. Hey, that Inyan for Hanukkah is faran v'yeder Inyan Torah. The idea of Hanukkah, as every Torah matter, oichin avodah ruchnis, also in the spiritual sense, in the spiritual service. Der Tate is mevayed in seine Ores. My father, the Rebbe's father, explains in his notes of Meseches Kiddushin, on the tractate Kiddushin, as by an Eved Ivri is do nor moichin de katnos, that a Jewish slave merely has the smaller level of intellect. Und der Riber, and therefore, wenn geht reis chofshi von sein Avdus, therefore, when he goes out free from his slavery, darpen im geben Hanukkah, you need to give him Hanukkah moichin de gadlus, the intellect of greatness, adult, not childish intellect. And the far is the Torah mefared by Hanukkah the drei minim. And that's why the Torah specifies, when it talks to Hanukkah, the three kinds, mitzoncho, megornecho, meyukvecha, three, while they correspond to the intellect, which is chochma, bina, and das, and corresponding to tzoncho, gornecho, and yikvecha. The sheep, the grain, and the wine. That inyan von odin ve'eved in ruchnius, the idea, the concept of a master and a slave in spiritually, made it also means a teacher and a student. Rabbi Yochanan gesagt, as Rabbi Yochanan said, as der was wird ihm lernen, wie zu verantworten nach gewissen in Torah, the one who can come and teach him how to answer a certain matter of Torah, he needed an explanation. He said, the one who's going to come and teach it to him, he had a difficulty. He says, I will carry his clothing to the bathhouse, meaning that he's going to become his servant. And that is similar to the work that a slave does for his master. So the teacher who's going to teach him, he says, I'm going to become your slave. So when the Rav is teaching the students, the teacher needs to know, as er muss geben dem Talmid Hanukkah, that you have to give the student Hanukkah, these extra. Das heißt, sich nicht benugenen, he cannot be satisfied mit geben ihm moichin de katnus, to give the student the smaller level of the intellect. Nor darf lernen mit ihm in an eif, but he must study with him in such a style, in such a way, as when der Talmid wächst, when the student is going to grow up, und geht weg von him, and he's going to leave him. That's because you give when you leave. So when he's going to leave him, that he also has this great intellect, the adult intellect of the Rav, of the teacher. In Porsche Verter Meitis, what does it mean in simple words? A Rav is mechuyev zu geben zu verstehen a Talmid. The teacher is obligated to give the student understanding the depth of the halacha with its reasoning well, not just tell him what the halacha is, but to explain the depth of the halacha and the reasoning. He must do it well. Even when that requires the halacha, that he will be needing to review the law, come upon him many times. Bis wird es verstehen, till he will understand it. The teacher has to do that. That's the hanoke. Das is der oimek was is in geder von hasoga seichel. This is the depth which is in the definition of understanding of the seichel ha-talmid. That's of the by the Talmud, that's his depth. By Merab, by the teacher, is as moichin the katas. This is small, this small. Nor derweil is dos noch nit masi. But in the meantime, he doesn't understand it. So the Rebbe is saying that those reason is still in the boundaries of seichel. That is not tzedakah yet. That he has to explain to him. That is still within the boundaries in which the student doesn't know it yet, but he's going to get there. Oh, but there's aspects, those matters that are higher than the definition, the boundaries, the limitations of the student's intellect. Was beim Rav the godless. Such ideas, such aspects, even by the teacher, they are considered to be intellectuals on a great level. Is a nit mechuyev to give them Talmud. That normally he would not be obligated to give the Talmud. And this is what the mitzvah Hanukkah tells us. Kum the mitzvah von Hanukkah. So now we come to the mitzvah of Hanukkah. When he's moisiv, and that adds, Ados is mitzadem chiv von the Talmud. That the above is the obligation a teacher to a student has to teach him the reasoning, the depth, well, for him to be able to understand and reach to the highest level that the students, according to the boundaries of the seichel of the Talmud. But now we have but when we come to charity Hanukkah, he needs to be so devoted and to put effort with the Talmud with the student. To the end of the day, the student will be able to take the depth of the teacher's intellect. If there is something by the teacher has, in the end of the day, this needs to reach the student. That's the tzedakah, that's the hanokkah, that's the extra that it has to give. The Zalbazach, this is talking about teaching Torah to minors. Well, same thing is with outreach, that people who are older, but they're still minors in their knowledge. The Zalbazach is benegeya, Vav. Same thing is as it relates them ton to work with in bringen divozainen noch ketanim, to bring those who are still minors, the talmidim and students in Yiddishkeit to Torah mitzvahs, to Torah mitzvahs. One can think, Asibaldi, and there is noch a maschel, since the other person is only a beginner, is genug v'melekt sich herein zu lernen mit him, it's sufficient. When you put yourself in to teach him, dos to was it is it's shaykh to that which he is presently connected, able to learn. Zok Torah says, Avibald is zayin a Talmid, Deiner Talmud, since he's your student, even if he only has learned from you one letter, wirst du angerufen, you are called the Rabbi Alufoi Umiyudoi. Those are the expressions that David HaMelech called Achi Teufel, who taught him one thing. You are considered his master, his teacher, his master, Alufoi Umiyudoi. Darfst ihm geben Hanukkah. A Rav must give a master, must give Hanukkah. You have to work with him in such a manner as that in the end he will reach to dein Darge in Yiddishkeit, to your level in Yiddishkeit. Durch der Avodah von Yidden, through the service, the work of Yidden, Avdei Hashem. We're also servants, we're slaves to Hashem, Avdei. In them Sheish Shonim Yavid, during the 6 years that we have to serve, which corresponds in the Shit Alfish Ninda Hava Alma, the 6,000 years that the world exists, at Mangorin Gichon Zoiche sein, so very speedily will merit to the Mubashvis Yoitze Lachov Shechinam. On the 7th year, you go out into freedom, free of charge. But those vet dan wird der Eibishter geben, then Hashem will give nit nur dem schar, not only the reward, was is be'erech zu der avodah bisman hazeh, which is relative to the work that we did in nowadays. But oich Hanukkah, the Eibishter will give us Hanukkah, the Giluyim, Achinailim, the greatest revelations, most elevated elevation was Kumen Nor B'Toyres Tzedakah. They only come as charity, Hanukkah, Bal Zei Zainen, in Ganzen Shaloi Berech zu der Aveda. They're totally have no comparison to the service. In the Melech Hashvi, in the 7,000 years, after the 6,000 years, the 7,000 year, Yom Shekulu Shabbos Menucha L'Chaya Elamim, the day which is entirely Shabbos and rest for eternal life. This is Mesichas Shabbos Parshas Re'eh, Tavshin Lamed Zayin.